very privileged to be part of this 100th anniversary celebration. It's an opportunity to reflect on the Legal Aid and Defender Association's future as well as its distinguished past. The British writer Aldous Huxley once wrote, "The charm of history and its enigmatic lesson consist in the fact that from age to age, nothing changes, and yet everything is completely different." When we look at LADA's origins, we see that much is indeed completely different from that day when attorney Ed Corcorny opened the first office of what was then the Legal Aid Society at the corner of Griswold and Ford. People working in the Moffett building could look out their office windows and see the new Model T Fords rolling by. It was the era of ragtime and vaudeville. A first-class stamp cost 2 cents. The family dishwasher was not a machine, but usually a child, old enough and responsible enough not to drop dishes and plates. Average worker earned $12.98 for a 59-hour week, and the average life expectancy was under 50 years of age. A very different world from what we know today. But there's much that has not changed. The people who walked through the Legal Aid Society's doors brought many of the same problems that legal aid clients have today. They were worried about being thrown out by a landlord or losing their homes to foreclosure. They were there with questions about immigration or about whether they had any recourse against unfair employment practices. And like many people today, they found themselves unable to pay for the legal services they so desperately needed. The difference, I think, is that more and more people are aware of and committed to providing legal services to the poor than was the case back in 1909. And a good part of the credit for that increased awareness goes to organizations like the Legal Aid Defender. We need to remember that back in 1909, it was pretty much taken for granted that access to the courts was the province of the rich. When it came to the poor, access to justice was viewed not as a right, but as a grace, a work of charity that had to be merited by the deserving. The only resource for most poor citizens was through what was called honorary counsel, members of the bar who voluntarily provided pro bono services to the poor. But clearly, then as now, pro bono service by the private bar was insufficient to meet the needs of an ever-expanding urban population. Toward the end of the 19th century, immigrant groups, as you saw in the CD, and bar associations began to form societies to offer legal aid to immigrants and poor people generally. So the Detroit Bar Association was part of a national trend when in 1909 it formed the Legal Aid Society. 10 years later, Reginald Huber Smith, a Harvard Law graduate and counsel to the Boston Legal Aid Society, spelled out a concept of legal services as we know it today. In an article entitled "Justice and the Poor," Smith challenged the legal profession to consider it an obligation to see that access to justice was available to all, without regard to ability to pay. He wrote, "Without equal access to the law, the system not only robs the poor of their only protection, but it places in the hands of their oppressors the most powerful and ruthless weapon ever invented. Smith urged a view of legal services for the poor, not as a charity for the deserving few, but as an essential feature of the American justice system. His article's influence reached to the very highest circles in the profession. And in 1926, for example, Chief Justice William Howard Taft wrote, "The real practical blessing of our Bill of Rights is in its provision for fixed procedure, securing a hearing by independent courts to each individual. But if the individual, in seeking to protect himself, is without money to avail himself of such procedure, the Constitution and the procedure made inviolable by it do not practically work. They don't work for the equal benefit of all." Something, Taft wrote, something must be devised by which everyone, however lowly, however poor, however unable by his means to employ a lawyer and to pay court costs, shall be furnished the opportunity to set the fixed machinery of justice in motion. 15 years later, in a speech to the American Bar Association, Associate Justice Wiley Rutledge put it more bluntly. He said, "Equality before the law in a true democracy is a matter of right. It cannot be a matter of charity, or of favor, or of grace, or of discretion." This profound shift in thinking quickly bore fruit, and in the early 1920s, the ABA created the Special Committee on Legal Aid Work. It recommended that every bar association create such a committee, and by that time, Detroit was a leader in providing free legal aid and was already 10 years into its program. Also, by that time, Detroit's Legal Aid Society was beginning to expand its role, becoming an advocate for legislative and public policy changes to assist the poor. In the early 1960s, a new model for legal services emerged. Foundations began to fund legal services programs as a part of multi-service social agencies based on a philosophy that legal services should be a component of an overall anti-poverty effort. At the same time, the United States government supported its commitment to equal justice under law with federal funding for civil legal assistance to low-income people. In response to the changing times, Detroit's legal aid added a criminal division in 1967. I can attest to that because I spent a year as an intern there while I was in Wayne State Law School. Detroit's legal aid soon after added divisions for juvenile law and the representation of indigent defendants in federal court. At the same time, the organization changed its name to Legal Aid and Defenders Association, symbolic of the expanded scope in its service. And once again, the needs of the time were driving the mission of the organization.